It's great to see everyone this morning. Thanks for joining us in person and also virtually. My name is Ann Geisinger. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Environmental Business Council, here to welcome you all to this forum. The first thing that I want to start with is a land acknowledgement, which I have written down, so I just wanted to acknowledge that UMass Boston is situated on the ancestral native homeland of those who walked here before us and those who still walk here, keeping in mind the integrity of this territory where the native peoples identify as Massachusetts, as well as their relatives and neighbors, the tribes of the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag and their descendants. So I just want to acknowledge that this land came before us and had peoples living on it and still living on it, where UMass Boston is situated, where we are today. So with that, I'm going to get started. So today's forum is covering heat and drought, both nationally, locally, regionally, with some really great speakers. For those who are new to the Climate Adaptation Forum, which I'll just go back briefly, we are a collaboration between the University of Massachusetts Sustainable Solutions Lab and the Environmental Business Council of New England. So the two groups work together. We have a steering committee of folks who help us plan these programs, who chair these programs, who invite the speakers, and who make it all happen. Today is our first hybrid event. Hopefully not our last, we'll see how it goes. We have about 50 people that registered to be here in person, about 100 that are online virtually right now. Just so you all know, we will be trying to take questions from both groups. So we do have somebody managing Q&A. We'll have questions from the virtual folks coming in. We'll try to do an every other. Somewhat will depend on when the questions come in. We are in our 5th year as a forum, and the forums are quarterly, and we try to address climate adaptation topics specifically, trying to fill a niche of talking and discussing climate adaptation regionally, nationally, internationally, covering a variety of topics. It's all on the website. There are actually past presentations on the website as well if you're curious to see what we have talked about in the past. So stay tuned for our next events. We typically have them in September, November, March, and June. So we'll take a little summer break, come back in September. I wanted to thank all of our sponsors and supporters. So we have sponsoring organizations who financially support this forum, which is fantastic. It allows us to provide registration at a reasonably achievable rate, and supports us trying out things like a hybrid event with a professional team who can make it a really good hybrid program. And we also have supporters, so organizations that are here to help us bring in speakers potentially or provide marketing support. So I wanted to thank all of these groups, companies, organizations for supporting the forum over the years. And I do want to thank our two co-chairs for today, Melanie Garate and Erin Wynette. Thank you so much for coordinating today, inviting speakers, doing a lot of emails, doing all the trial runs, speaker calls, agenda. It's been a lot, and they took on coordination of a hybrid for the first time, so I appreciate them dedicating their time to that. So I'm going to introduce Erin Wynette, who is the co-chair, who's going to do some introductions this morning. He is manager of climate change and resilience for AECOM. He has about over 20 years of experience, hazard mitigation planning, climate change adaptation and resilience services, socioeconomic and demographic analyses, water resources planning, and environmental assessments. And Erin was one of our steering committee members. Thank you very much, Erin. This is for you.
All right, thank you very much, Anne, for those great opening remarks, and thank you everyone who's here in the room and who's joining us from wherever you are. I'm told I need to speak closely to this mic so they can hear me. I know you guys can hear me, but I want to make sure everyone hears me. This is truly a hybrid event. As Anne said, we have over 100 people registered remotely. So just a little housekeeping rules before we get into the more exciting stuff. Since this is a hybrid event, you're going to see a lot of mic handing going on and off, and we do encourage and want you to ask questions, but we ask for your patience as we kind of rove through the room and hand you the mic. If you do not have a mic in front of you, the remote audience will not be able to hear you. So we want you to be heard, and we want to hear from you. So just patience as we work through this, but we have a great team here. There's a lot of tech here. I'm really excited. Cameras, monitor, everything's going to work great. Fingers crossed. So with that, I will start with just some opening remarks on what we're going to cover, and it's going to be really focused on drought and extreme heat. as Anne mentioned. So most of my conversations about water here in the Northeast, there's too much of it. We're blessed with primarily a good source of water, but that's not always the case. We'll start by talking about the opposite of too much water, basically drought. And to start with a few findings from a recent release from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'll read from my notes here. The findings say heavy exploitation of limited water supplies, especially in the western US and northern Mexico, and deteriorating fresh water management infrastructure have heightened water security impacts and risks. Also, intensified droughts and earlier runoff from diminished snowpack will increase water scarcity during the summer peak water demand period, especially in regions with extensive irrigated agriculture, leading to economic losses and increased pressures on limited groundwater as a substitute for diminished surface water supplies. So there's some big issues out here that we're working with. And today you're going to hear from our keynote, Brenda Berman, who will inform us about how the arid southwestern United States is grappling with this record drought conditions they're experiencing now, as well as what they're doing to plan for the future. Then you'll hear from one of our local specialists on what drought means for the Northeast, which most of you here are local to the Boston area here in person, but remotely we have people from all around the country. She'll be talking about some tools that are available to help plan and manage for drought. And unfortunately, our third speaker for drought is not able to join us this morning. It's a reminder that COVID is still with us. So Dr. Margaret Redsteer was going to speak to us about seasonal changes, how that can contribute to drought, and what people experience, how that can contribute to understanding vulnerabilities. So we definitely miss her presence here. She was going to be presenting virtually, but if we can get her materials, we'll distribute them after the event, but wish her a speedy and healthy recovery. Then after the break, we'll switch over to the other focus, extreme heat. So it doesn't feel like it necessarily today if you're here in Boston, but hot days are getting hotter and more frequent. Extreme heat can increase the risk of other types of disasters. Heat can exacerbate drought, and hot, dry conditions can help spark wildfires. Extreme heat also has significant public health implications. Extreme heat is one of the leading causes of death, weather-related deaths in the United States. So this morning, you'll be hearing how the cities of Phoenix and Boston have developed and are implementing strategies to tackle this extreme heat threat. And our program will then conclude with a panel discussion involving both our drought and extreme heat presenters. That'll give us a really good opportunity to look at the interplay between these stressors, and really looking forward to a good conversation on that. So that's enough of hearing me talk. I'm going to turn things over to our keynote after I do a brief introduction. Brenda Berman, who has more than 25 years of experience working on Western water and natural resource issues. She's been committed to finding collaborative solutions to secure reliable water supplies for communities, farms, tribes, and the environment as they face drought, climate change, and infrastructure issues. She joined the Central Arizona Project in 2021 as a new executive strategy advisor. And before that, she was the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and really notable that she's the first woman to hold that position. So with that, I'm proud to introduce Brenda as our keynote. Brenda?
I knew that was slippery. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's great to be back in Boston. I lived here for a couple years after college back in the 90s, so I was just looking out at the Charles, thinking I used to run there, like over from Charlestown up and around the Cambridge footbridge and back, and it's incredible. Now I think I would get very hurt if I tried to run that, but it's good to be back. This is a beautiful city. I thought this morning, I appreciated the invitation. I'm from Arizona, and in Arizona, we're a little bit different than you are here in Massachusetts. And let me talk about a few of the ways. So I think you're hearing a lot more in the national newspapers. We're seeing a lot more in the international newspapers about what's going on in the American Southwest. But just to give sort of a little bit of background, Arizona is the home of the Grand Canyon. Arizona is the home of 18 national parks and monuments. We are, unlike East Coast states, we are over 80% public land. So that's tribal, that's federal, national park, that's Department of Defense, has over 3 million acres in Arizona. They'll usually, just as an aside, they will let you backpack on Department of Defense land, but you have to sign a waiver that says if they bomb you by accident, that's too bad. So those lands are an incredible resource for those of us who live there and those of us who visit. But what it also means is there are much more prescribed places of where you can live, where you can have industry, where you can grow your economy. When the national news starts to talk about the Colorado River, they make it sound like it's the only source in the West. And Arizona is similarly situated to our sister states, and that Colorado River is a very important resource to our state, but at the same time, it's not our only resource. So if you look at the water supplies we're using now, it's about 41% groundwater. You can see the list. Our in-state rivers, in opposition to the Colorado River, have remained very stable. We have been seeing drought, but as far as climate change predictions, they're predicted to remain very stable. But we're also, we've been leading edge on using reclaimed water in the past. About 40, 50 years ago, we were really at the forefront of that. Today, I would say it's something that we need to be investing in more. But we do have a diversity of supplies, and it really depends where you are, how that works. So these are the headlines you've been seeing. And they often refer to the Southwest like we're going to dry up and go away. And I'm here to tell you how we've been responding these many years and how we look at ourselves. But we realize there's a lot more focus on us than there has been before. And that can be good and bad, because I think as water managers, are there water managers in the audience? We'll go with those who are here. Okay, I see one. Anybody else? Two. As water managers, our job has been, and those who went before us, our job has been to make sure that you don't think about water. Our job is to make sure that water is at your tap, water is there for your lawn, water is there for industry and your economy. And so we're a group of people who are used to working very hard and working with each other, but not necessarily in a national spotlight. So this is new, but I think it's good because I think it's giving a more national understanding, which can help you in Congress and helps others understand really what's going on. But I wanted to, that's the purpose of today, get behind these headlines so you can understand a little bit more about what's really happening in Arizona and the rest of the Southwest. So, the Colorado River, a few basics. So the Colorado River flows through 7 states in the United States. It is responsible for 2 states in Mexico. So we have 2 countries, 9 states. 40 million people ultimately receive their drinking water from the Colorado River, over 5 million acres of agriculture. This is a hard-working river. It is, someone's probably trademarked it, but it is often called the hardest working river we have, and it's certainly in the United States. It is an important source of hydropower. We have incredible infrastructure. So when you look at the West, I think what you need to understand is in the 20th century, early 20th century, the United States and the groups that lived in the West invested heavily in infrastructure, and that's Hoover Dam, one of the top man-made wonders of the world, and that's Lake Mead, you can see on the map. And later in the 1950s, Lake Powell was built, which is Glen Canyon Dam. Together, they hold over 50 million acre-feet of water. An acre-foot is something we talk about in the West. And it is enough water to cover 1 acre, 1 foot deep. And I don't know who came up with that, but there it is. But what we say in Arizona is 1 acre-foot can serve 3 families for a year. if you want another way to think about it. You know, a family of 4, 3 families. So the West has been highly dependent on this clean hydropower, on this water source. But what we're learning is that this source is not as dependable as we once thought it was. So just again for bearings, you can see a little bit of the different rivers that are flowing or not flowing in Arizona. Many of them are seasonal. But we're highly dependent on that infrastructure. So in the Colorado River Basin, we talk about an upper basin and a lower basin. So if you're in the upper basin, you're Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico. And if you're in the lower basin, that's California, Nevada, and Arizona. The upper basin is where most of the rain and snow falls. The lower basin is where the large majority of those people and the economy are located. So this infrastructure has been used for decades to control how much water is needed. So it's always been a flashy system. So you could have great big wet years, in which case you hold that water in storage, and then you can have very dry years. And we've been able to make deliveries, one through our treaty to Mexico. The United States has never faltered on its treaty responsibilities to Mexico, but also until this last few years, to the lower basin states. They have been used to getting 100% of their allocations and supply. But what do we know about today? So today we are in a 22-year drought. And we talk about the paleo record on the Colorado River, and that is the tree rings. The tree rings go back about 1,200 years. So when you look at the tree rings, some say this is the worst drought period that has ever happened that we know about. Others say, oh no, the 1500s was a little bit drier. I don't know if we're first or second, but what I can tell you is it's been very difficult. Our infrastructure has gotten us this far, but we are really reaching a point where we're going to have to be working harder, working faster, moving forward. So scientists tell us, there's been numerous studies that this drought is about 40% climate change. So it's a natural drought exacerbated by climate change is what many have told us. So just to get a visual, and I highly recommend a trip to the Southwest, but this is Lake Mead when it was full, and to the right is Lake Mead. This is last year, so it's actually a little more empty now. But if you have a chance to visit, it's really an incredible sight. One, as you look over, you now see rocks, and that's a little worrisome, but it's a very well-engineered system, so it can take water down to very deep levels. Lake Mead is known as having what's called a bathtub ring, and that is calcification up to the high water line. So when you look at pictures of Lake Mead, they will often show this line, and that's basically high water mark to where it is now, the bathtub ring. So what have we done in this basin? This is a picture of our history of storage. So on the bottom, we have Lake Mead, and it began filling in the 1930s. And the blue, and then in the gray, that is Lake Powell. So Lake Powell is completed in about 1964, and it begins to fill. So you can see from these many years in between, we felt pretty darn confident about our water sources. And moving forward, that was right up until about 2000, 2004. And all of a sudden, between 2000 and 2004, we lost half our storage. So we went from basically full to about 50%. And this was a wake-up call to those of us who worked in the basin. I was working at, for the United States at the time, but we knew if we had 4 more years like that, the system would be empty, and that's our water supply. But let me give you a little background first. So this basin isn't new to controversy. This basin isn't new to having to face very difficult issues together. In fact, 2022 is the 100-year anniversary of the 7 basin states coming together back in 1922. I believe it was the first interstate compact for water. And so this is a big year for us. There are a lot of celebrations, there's a lot of folks coming together, but we have 100 years of coming to agreement in this basin. So if you look across the timeline, you'll see a lot of legislation. So 1928 is the Boulder Canyon Project Act. It's very important to the lower basin in the Colorado River states because one, it authorizes Hoover Dam, but two, it laid out the allocations for the states. It said Arizona, California, Nevada, who really couldn't decide between themselves, here is what's going to happen. Here is how much water you will be allowed to take from the Colorado River. But a series of legislation. And then what you start to see really in the last 25 years is, I call it the modern age on the Colorado River. And it is absolutely about collaboration. So just to talk about a few of kind of our agreements that we've been able to put together. What you find when, after that 2004 drop, when we knew maybe the system wasn't as resilient as we thought it was, the 7 states came together with the United States and we put in guidelines. We put in kind of rules of the road. We came to agreement in 2007 and what we said was, how can we make this better? How can we make it more predictable? Because if you're a water manager, the number one thing you want is predictability. Then you know how to invest, you know how to look at your redundant supplies, you know how to bring things together. And so the 2007 Act and the 2007 agreement did that. And that's where we start to talk about tiers. That's where we start to talk about levels of Lake Mead. So when you hear in the newspaper, we're in a tier 1 shortage, that means we've dropped to a certain level in Lake Mead, below 1075. And it's the 2007 agreement that created this framework for us. But what it also did, which was incredibly innovative, was it started incentivizing conservation. So it said, we will give you free storage in Lake Mead. We will take this huge piece of infrastructure that the United States built and the water users and power users have paid back the cost of, and we will give you free storage. You'll take a little bit of hit for evaporation, but if you can save water in your state, if you can invest in new infrastructure. So together, we've all invested in new regulating reservoirs so we don't lose water in rainstorms. Together, we've invested in farm efficiencies, both in Mexico and in the United States. Together, we've invested in fallowing sometimes. You pay someone not to farm, and they leave that water behind in Lake Mead. And so when you see after 2004, it sort of bounces along. That's really the reason. But also in this last 30 years, around 2010, there was a horrible earthquake in Mexico, right on the border with the United States. And it really tore apart their agriculture infrastructure. And so the United States stepped in right away. We started working with Mexico, and we said, and it came to agreement, that they could save water in the United States, in Lake Mead. And if you think about it, kind of across the world, can you picture China saying to another country, why don't you save water in our country? Or can you picture Egypt going to Eritrea and saying, would you mind if we just, I know you built your infrastructure, but would you mind if we just hold our water there? It's an incredibly smart, innovative thing to do, and it has made the relationship with Mexico even stronger. So since that time, those agreements have been sort of re-upped, they've been put back together, and enhanced. So we got to 2019, and everything we'd done in 2007 was important, but we also learned it wasn't enough. We were losing our water supply. And so in 2019, again, the 7 states came together with the environmental community, with the tribal communities, and other stakeholders, and we made another agreement. And we said, we haven't done enough, we need to put more on the table. So we put more water on the table, more cuts to the system, more incentives for conservation, more incentives for infrastructure. And that's really how we've gotten this far. So all of those agreements took a certain number of years. But we got to about August last year, 2021, and we realized the modeling was telling us the system is in real trouble. We need to do more. It's starting to be our story. We need to do more. So in 2021, in August, the basin states managed to come together in about 3 months and come up with what we call the 500 plus plan. And the 500 plus plan is how can we go find 500,000 acre feet voluntarily paid for the next few years so that we can help prop up Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So that's moving forward right now. It's a partnership with farms, with cities, with tribes, and tribes have been an incredible part of this. There are 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin, 22 of them are in Arizona. The tribal communities in general have the highest and highest priority water rights, so they are integral parts of all of these discussions that we've been going through. So this is what all of those agreements have done, all of those incentives for conservation. We have been able to save 65 feet. This is the official report from last year. I think when it comes out this year in June, it's going to show us it's about 70 feet. That's about 5 million acre feet, which is an incredible amount of water. It is probably near $1 billion of investment. And that is how we've been able to stabilize Lake Mead and Lake Powell at this point. What is one of the major issues? So there's several of why our system continues to go down, but I think this is one of the most important, and that is our average amount of water that we are receiving is declining and continues to decline. So you can see the average for the recorded period, 116 years, 14.7 million acre feet. That's how much water flows into the system each year. But the 10-year average is at 11.8 million acre feet. And if you get the 5-year average, it's even lower than that. This is what we're facing. Each time we think we get on top of our problems, it turns around and we learn we haven't done enough. So we know that, we're addressing it. And one of the things to know about the Colorado River is those agreements we made back in 2007 about how to hold everything together, they run out in 2026. It was a 20-year deal. So we are looking at working together to come up with new rules, or maybe extend the old ones, in the middle of very deep and worsening drought, in the middle of having reduced water supplies, and in the middle of being some of the fastest growing cities in the United States. So how do we find common ground? We find common ground through very good data and modeling. The United States Bureau of Reclamation is really the holder of that data, but it's available to everyone. Mexico gets this data the same time my organization, Central Arizona Project, does. But also, we can all use this software. You can be trained in this software. You can run it for your own organization. So we have a large amount of trust and understanding about what we're measuring and what we're trying to project through modeling. The United States, the Bureau of Reclamation, puts out a study every month, and it's a 24-month study. It looks ahead 2 years about where do we think our water elevations are going to be. So this is how we get the idea that we could be dropping to much more precipitous levels as we move forward. So this is for Lake Powell, and the green line is the most probable, about the 50% projection. The blue line is really, if it's wet, it's sort of the 90th wettest projection. And the red line is 10%, sort of our driest projections. So you've heard a lot about Lake Powell in the news lately. Lake Powell, again, is formed by Glen Canyon Dam. And the number one thing we need to protect is our infrastructure. Because if we can get water and find new supplies and move things along, we need our infrastructure. So in addition to being a very important source for the West of hydropower and grid stability, Lake Powell is also the feeding dam for Lake Mead. It's above Grand Canyon National Park. The water flows through Grand Canyon to Lake Mead. But the engineering on this system is a little more difficult than down at Hoover Dam. And that's because if the water drops too low, you start putting air into the penstocks. And that could cause damage, cavitation. It could wreck your hydro system. It means that you can't draw hydroelectricity from it. And so right now there's been a series of programs. The lower basin left water behind in Lake Powell. The upper basin has released water from upper basin reservoirs. We are projecting basically levels at Lake Powell that allow hydroelectricity to continue, but also the infrastructure to remain stable. This is Lake Mead modeling, similar. It shows us what could possibly be happening in the next 2 years. So where does that leave us now? That leaves us in 2022. We know we are having hotter and drier conditions. We know that the runoff is happening sooner. We also know that when we get 90% of the snow or precipitation as an average, we are likely to only get this year maybe 50% of the runoff. In 2021, we had almost 90% of precipitation, and we had about 36% of average runoff. The land is drier. I believe our next speaker was going to talk about wind and maybe dust and all these other things that affect our land and aridification. But we are getting less runoff from the same amount of snowfall. And that's hard because it's hard to predict. What it means is we're in a tier 1 shortage. We are expected to be in a tier 2 shortage next year. That means over a third of Arizona's Colorado River supply is gone. So that has taken out a lot of farming in central and southern Arizona. It means that even cities and tribes are affected by a tier 2 shortage. And 24 and 25, I think you saw from some of those lines, we could have serious issues in the future. But we are prepared and we are preparing. So the cities in Arizona and in California and Colorado and Nevada have been making incredible investments in conservation. People see golf courses and they think, how can you have golf courses in the desert? Well, these golf courses use less water than anywhere else in the United States. And they are largely on reclaimed water, but they also, golf courses, unless they have very old grandfathered rights in Arizona, they're desert. So the green is green, but all around it is desert. And they are large economic drivers. But we've been putting millions of acre feet underground in storage to save for a rainy day. We are looking at augmentation, desalinization, water from other sources. And we have been heavily investing in reuse. There's a program right now in LA looking at a large recycling, reuse water supply, and Nevada and Arizona are investing in it. And it's going to be a joint program moving forward. So a lot of innovation going on, a lot of investment. But that leaves us with what are we going to do in the next 3 years? Because the new rules are up for adoption. There's not a blueprint yet. We're working with the 7 basin states, we're working with the tribes, we're working with the environmental community. But what our history in this basin shows is that we will meet our challenges. We have done it before. It is getting much harder. When you have less water to share, it's harder to be innovative. It's harder to make deals with your neighbors. It's harder to politically stand up and say, I am willing to let, say, Colorado have more water, but Arizona might have more stability. And those are difficult things. There'll be difficult things for water managers. There'll be difficult things for the United States, and they'll be difficult as political leadership also has to face this. But we are working strongly with Mexico, with our basin state partners across the spectrum. That is what we're facing. That's what we're working on. So that's my little bit of a peek behind the headlines. And thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Brenda. That was really eye-opening. Again, we see some of the headlines, but that was really helpful to kind of get a little bit, peel back a couple layers of the onion and kind of learn a little bit more about everything that's going out there and challenges that are being addressed and that you're planning to work forward on. So we're going to have some time for Q&A here. Like I said, it'll be a little, you'll have to just be patient as we work through the logistics behind it. I have a couple questions that I'll start with, and then happy to take questions from the room. If you do have a question, we just ask, raise your hand. We'll direct someone over to a mic. Again, if you are not mic'd, you will not be heard by our wonderful virtual attendees. And then we will also be fielding questions from those who are participating remotely. So please do enter your questions into the chat if you're participating remotely. And we have one of our colleagues here, Lauren, who's going to be helping us manage the Q&A from that. So just to start, a couple questions, Brenda, is what role does the federal government play when it comes to a shortage on the Colorado River? Where do they stand? How do they get involved, and what are they doing?
There we go. Thank you. So the federal government plays a very interesting role on the Colorado River. They really own and operate most of the major infrastructure, the large dams in the upper basin. But in the lower basin, back to that 1928 act, it made the secretary the water master of the river. And that means she has incredible powers. They were bounded by Congress as far as which state gets which amounts of water. But the Secretary of the Interior really has an incredible amount of discretion about how to call shortages, when to call shortages. And that was part of that 2007 agreement we all came to. It was about us, instead of guessing what a secretary might do in the future, we put together the rules of the road. When the Lake Mead hits certain elevations, we will call different levels of shortage. Those different levels of shortage will mean Arizona gives up a certain amount of water. Under the 2019 program, California will give up a certain amount of water. But the secretary still retains great powers in the Colorado River.
Great. And then you were talking, a lot of the focus was managing the water supply and looking at ways to work with that going forward. But for some of the key infrastructure that's part of the system, how are you looking at climate change impacts to all the infrastructure that comprises the system and the impacts?
Well, my organization is Central Arizona Project, and what we do is we bring water from the Colorado River into central and southern Arizona. So we have a over 330-mile canal. We have several pumping stations to get that water uphill and then downhill to Phoenix and then uphill again to Tucson. And so for our organization, we're looking at climate change from a macro level. How much water will we have in the canal? How much water can we deliver? How can we help our communities deal with and adapt to how much water may be there in the future? But also more on our own micro level. So over half my organization is in the field, laborers, electricians, mechanics, and it's hotter. Luckily in Arizona, we're pretty good at dealing with hot. That's what we've been living with. We can deal with that. But we need to know what is possible. Storms are flashier. We had a storm take out part of our canal last year. And those things can happen. We basically bypass most of the state, so there will be flash storms. Our system was built to withstand those, but it means there's likely to be more. So what we built for and engineered for in the past will likely need to be faster and ready to make repairs when we need to. So we're looking at our workforce, we're looking at our infrastructure overwhelmingly, but we're trying to look at it from all different levels. We're very active in some national organizations, working with other water utilities, water best practices. How are we all going to work on this together?
Super. Thank you very much. And with that, looks like I have a question, at least remotely. Maybe we'll start with a couple from our virtual audience, and then we will have Jackson, who has very long legs, a great stride, so he can cover the room with ease. But we'll do a couple virtual questions and then get someone here in the room. So Lauren.
Okay, thanks, Brenda. We have a bunch in the chat, so let's just go with two to start. The first one is, can you tell us more about the long-term infrastructure plans and development to address increasing or decreasing precipitation? And they mean more like 50, 100-year long-term.
Well, I like the way they think because that's the job of water managers, right? Is to not only make sure that water is delivered tomorrow, but to make sure that 50 years from now, the next generation, we've made the investments necessary so that their water supply is stable as well. There's a lot of talk about augmentation right now and looking at our friends in Mexico. Could there be, they also are facing the same issues as far as water supply reliability. Could we invest in desalinization with Mexico, possibly with California? It's probably easier to work with Mexico than it is with California some days. But looking at that as a possible supply because it is, immune from drought. Also, I mentioned the recycling program in Los Angeles, where Nevada and Arizona are also investing, looking at large-scale recycling. And that is also, we can certainly enhance that in Arizona and our larger cities, but being able to find those new supplies, which is often reusing in new ways your old supplies.
Thank you. That kind of gets to the second question where Jane Knott was asking about wastewater, desalinization, groundwater in terms of water supply. So do you have any other comments on that?
I think I might just add, in addition to that above ground storage that we have in Lake Mead and we have in our state, my project has over 1 million acre feet of storage, or about 1 million acre feet, and we use that to be smart, to hold your water so you can deliver it at the right time, deliver it when energy prices are lower. But what was the rest of the question?
Just how important groundwater,
very good.
desal, wastewater recycling, all that is.
So in addition to that, the major cities in Arizona and the tribes have been putting a lot of water underground. So when they haven't had full demand for their allocation of water, they've been putting it underground in Arizona. And we have over 12 million acre feet of water underground, which is an incredible amount of water. If you think about it, that's about 4 to 5 years worth of water supply that would, just on Colorado River, that would come into the state. So that is sort of the bank account. There are a lot more questions about how you get it out than how you put it in. And those are being worked on kind of as we speak.
I have another virtual, but we can go to the room.
Yeah, let's see if we can get someone in the room. I see one over there in the corner. Jackson?
Jackson, John Bolduc said that you're like Robert Williams, so go for it.
That's the best compliment I've ever gotten.
That works. Got Peter Von Zweck with Jacobs, and it was a great presentation demonstrating supply issues and volume. And I'm wondering, from the effects of the decreased volume, increases in use and reuse, are there more challenges coming up on water quality that's being made available? And if so, what kind of initiatives would you initiate to address water quality topics?
So I am lucky in that in my current position and my past position, we deliver raw water. So we deliver water to, in many cases, treatment plants. So to about 5 million people, but they're served through the treatment plants of their individual communities. So there are issues with water quality. The Colorado River is often groundwater first. Groundwater usually takes the least treatment and is the cheapest supply you can usually provide in Arizona. Colorado River is probably the best quality after that. Our in-state rivers are very high in natural salts. They can be high in other natural, what would you call them? Pieces. Minerals, thank you. That's a great word. So water quality has not been the same issue, but as you receive less and less water in the system, the salinity will go up. The Colorado River is already salty. That certainly affects agriculture. There are millions of acre feet of agriculture. Mexico certainly feels that because they're largely using that water for agriculture. It's a different, certainly the local communities, and I see there's someone from City of Phoenix later today, they can be asked, but the groundwater has, its own challenges. Sometimes it can be too salty, sometimes it can have arsenic, sometimes you pull too much out and the quality changes. While water quality isn't my bailiwick, but it's certainly affected by less supply.
See if we can get another question in the room. Anyone? Raise your hand if you have one. Right in the middle.
Good morning. My name is Lindsay Neighbor, and I'm with the Charles River Watershed Association. So my question was more about how we can ensure infrastructure is equitable, specifically relating to equity in tribal communities. I'm definitely not an expert on this, but from the pandemic, I heard how specifically the Navajo Nation has a lack of access to running water, and a lot of times they are having to haul water from sources that aren't the Colorado River. And I was curious how we're ensuring that the infrastructure is equitable and how we are facilitating conversations that are inclusive and recognize the historical and existing power structures.
Very good question and thorough. I'll talk about maybe the last part first, which is in Arizona, in order to come to the 2019 agreement that they did, which was putting more water on the table, which is a very difficult thing to do. It was going to affect tribes. It was going to affect agriculture, two very powerful forces in Arizona. What they did is they brought together a large drought contingency plan, DCP kind of organization, and it was over 40 parties in the state, including tribes and the environmental community, but it also was public. So anyone in the public could attend, but there were 40 people at the table, including representatives from the governor, from our State Department of Water Resources, from the United States was there. And that's how they worked through how Arizona was going to address decreasing supply for that 2019 agreement. We have a similar structure set in place for looking at 2026, how we bring those parties together. It's really run by the Department of Water Resources and also Central Arizona Project, my organization, but it's about making sure all the major parties are in the room. For the United States side, for that big 2019 agreement, we had hundreds of meetings with the tribal communities. And in Arizona, that took the effect of there would be a pre-meeting to discuss what was coming up with the big meeting in Arizona, and discussion with the tribes that were sitting at the table so they'd understand how the rest of the community thought. And then there would be a debriefing afterwards. And so there were generally at least 2 meetings for every one meeting, every big public meeting. And that led to hundreds of meetings with the tribal communities. That doesn't mean from the United States point of view that we got it right necessarily. I think the tribal communities would say we'd like to be involved earlier. That's what they're saying about 2026. And so there's a lot of effort going on right now. I'm not with the United States anymore, but they certainly, they've named leadership. They are looking at how they can be even more inclusive in the future. As far as infrastructure, it's a tough question. I think the statistic I've heard is about 1/3 of the Navajo Nation needs to haul its water. It's a very rural, dispersed community in most cases, but there are signs of light. So when I was with the department, with Bureau of Reclamation, we completed the first line of a new clean water supply to the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and also to the Jicarilla Apache. So that has been over 10 years in the making. We managed to do that with Navajo crews during the pandemic, and Navajo Nation was one of the most hard-hit communities with the pandemic, but we got that done. There's 2 main laterals. The first one is finished and delivering clean, safe water to the Navajo community and the Jicarilla. So an incredibly proud moment when I was with Bureau of Reclamation. They're working on the second lateral as we speak. Utah, they have an agreement and a settlement which will bring funding into the community that they can spend on their water systems. And in Arizona, I'm recused at the moment from working on that settlement, but there have been settlement talks. I think they've broken down a little bit, but on the Arizona side, that would be the last state and portion to kind of enter into a large water settlement with the United States.
Great question, and thanks for sharing what's being done on that. And I think we have time for one more virtual question before we move on to our next speaker.
Okay, this one comes from John Boldock. He's asking the hard question per usual: is the drought leading to discussions about what the maximum carrying capacity is in the Southwest in terms of population and level of development?
So I think there are probably a lot of people more qualified to answer that question than I am, but I'll take a stab. let's take Phoenix, for example. Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the United States, smaller than Houston, bigger than Philadelphia. And the Phoenix area is using the same amount of water it did in 1957. And in large part, in our cities, we have been able to divorce population from how much water demand is needed. And a lot of that has been through recycling and conservation. There are very similar statistics in Denver and Los Angeles and in other places. So there's been so much work on conservation, and I'm not saying there doesn't need to be more. There does need to be more, particularly as we look into the future. But in large part, we've been able to accommodate growth. Arizona in particular passed in 1980 something called the Groundwater Management Act. And what that said was that if you are in the major population areas, it's another question if you're in the rural areas, but if you're in the major population centers, if you want to put in, say, a new housing development, you have to be able to prove that you have a 100-year water supply. So you need to prove that that's financially possible. You need to prove that that's physically available. It's unprecedented. I don't know of anywhere else in the United States that does that. So on the Arizona side, at least in our major communities, that is being addressed. Of course, there are issues. There are things that we probably need to back up and ways that we could do it better. But in rural areas, that's been different. There's a lot of problems with people sinking the deepest well and drying up others and that sort of thing. But we've got at least those first steps right, I think.
Thank you, John, for that question, and thank you, Brenda, for a great talk and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
And it's my pleasure, thanks again, pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Vicki Zolte. She serves as the state hydrologist for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so we're coming back local. She also heads up drought monitoring and serves as a technical lead for special studies that include topics such as climate and hydrology, change projections, and communicating risk based on projections. So with that, Vicki, you're welcome to come over to the podium and move forward with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to cover a number of activities that the state is doing, the state of Massachusetts or Commonwealth of Massachusetts is doing for preparing for the extremes of climate change with a focus on drought and heat being today's topic. But as you'll see, a lot of these activities do address the full spectrum of climate impacts that we're expecting. So everyone's getting used to the headlines of record hot summers, record hot days or weeks or whatever time periods are being analyzed. This is one example from 2020 summer. It was the hottest summer over a 126-year record. And partly what's disturbing is that we're setting records all the time and records over just the most recent record. The other headline is droughts. We've been having more frequent droughts, and same with flooding. It seems like folks are getting concerned about drought fatigue and the messaging, but it is what's happening, and the balancing between extremes that was projected. We're not going to have average conditions. It's going to be no water or too much water and floods in the middle of droughts. This is an example from Worcester, Massachusetts in 2016, which was the worst drought since the 1960s, which was or is still the drought of record. The droughts are so different now, it's a bit hard to compare what's worst. And then in the middle of it was a 4-inch rainstorm in one day, causing the flooding conditions you see. And I guess the most insulting part of that is that most of that runs off and doesn't soak in and recharge the hydrologic system, so you can go right back to the drought that you were in. Here is a precipitation time series from the Lawrence, Massachusetts station, and it's showing you around the zero. Zero is the average precipitation, and it's showing departures above or below. And the black box is telling you one standard deviation, which customarily is considered within normal variability or normal range. And then you see a lot of blue lines going below that, showing the deficit in precipitation. And then the red boxes are outlining droughts that are in in the history recorded somewhere. So you'll see that the droughts are getting more frequent in recent years, but the other piece is that they're not necessarily as much of a precipitation deficit as back in the 80s you see, and in the 60s even. But then why are we getting record low stream flow and groundwater levels? So you see 3 recent droughts here, all of which, and this is for stream flow gauges. So on the y-axis, you see the percent of gauges across the state that recorded a record low value. And then you see that in 2016, a bunch of records were set over and above and beyond the 2002. And in 2016 in particular, in July, almost 30% or a third of the state was setting record low levels. And I should say that a lot of these gauges do go back to the 60s and even 50s and some in the 40s. So setting these records is a pretty big deal. And then the same thing happened in 2020, more records being set. So if the precipitation is not quite as bad as it was before and we're setting records, what is it that's causing this? And as usual with the environment, it's very multifactorial and they feed on each other. But one aspect is changing the distribution of rain. So our annual rainfall is still the same or even increasing, but within the year, the different months, it's not as evenly distributed. We've always had sort of a drier season in the late summer and early fall, but now there's more extremes between how the rain falls between the months, not as evenly distributed, the drier period getting drier. And then also, as you saw with the Worcester example, even within a week, you can get a drought or a flood. So that's certainly a huge piece of it. And then with the extreme precipitation coming down and is not recharging the hydrologic system, so it's not really as effective. So we're losing a lot of the precipitation we used to be able to recharge and make use of. Another aspect is increasing temperatures are causing increasing evapotranspiration, and this again is exacerbating the growing season, which is usually at least part of the natural dry season. And this became a big deal in 2016 when we had a flash drought, meaning there was a very quick onset to the drought, and part of that was precipitation deficit, but a huge part of it was the evapotranspiration. And so we worked a lot on that index and are proposing a revised index for that in the coming weeks. So the evapotranspiration piece is big. It makes the drought set on quick, which was not how drought response was set up before. We used to monitor monthly, now we monitor weekly. And this piece is really something we keep focusing on. And then of course I have to mention impervious surfaces that keep from recharging the groundwater. And when groundwater discharges as base flow to the streams, that's what stream flow is when there's no precipitation. It's groundwater. So all these factors really contribute to setting all these records, both stream flow that you see on the charts, but also groundwater. We had records. So how is the Commonwealth preparing for these extremes? You can think about it in three clusters. There's data and information that the state has pulled together from outside sources, but has also generated itself, its own studies. And then guidance, how to use those numbers. There's always limitations with projections and numbers. Also best management practices, adaptive management and the value of that. And then also funding. There's several town level programs. So there's a number of items under all of these. And I know you'll have my slides later. So today I'm just going to focus on the data piece and run through those items. And I'll be available for questions. You'll have my contact info at the end, and you'll also have the website link for each of these things that I'll discuss. So no worries about the pace that we'll go with. So we'll start with resilientma.org. This would be the main resource I would want you to remember. This is the climate change clearinghouse for the state for climate adaptation for local and state level actions. And you see a screenshot here, and you'll see some of my screenshots are partial. They didn't quite fit the slide, but gives you a flavor for it. And this is a working website, a living website, and we're constantly working to put more items on it, and it's aimed to be the comprehensive place to go. And because of that, there's a lot on there. So there are multiple ways to find information by the type of information you're looking for, the sector you're interested in, or maybe the climate change impact that you want to look into. And then you can also view the data on a map. A dashboard is going to be released in the coming months. It's in development right now. That will show you tables and graphics and be able to download some of those resources. And then you can also do raw data downloads for some of the data that's produced by the state. And one of the things that you will find highlighted on this website is the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, which is lovingly referred to as SHMCAP. In 2018, Massachusetts was the first state to align these two plans. And as you can imagine, these hazards and how the climate change is going to affect those hazards very much interact. And so this makes a lot of sense and was a great step forward. And you see some of the topics listed that are covered in there. These are just the ones related to today for heat and drought, but it does cover all hazards and all climate change topics. And in 2018, this plan focused on state assets and actions, so it was very focused on that. But now in 2023, we're going to be assessing all impacts across the state, so for all the sectors, and hopefully this will make it applicable to the whole state, and a much broader range of people can benefit from the assessments. The Climate and Hydrologic Risk Project. So this has been going on for about 2 years and is still in progress. Some of the products that I'll talk about will be released in the coming months, and some might not be for another couple of years. So the goals of this project was to enable risk-based decision-making for climate change. There were really two goals. One was to have the latest science and the most local. So a lot of the projections are downscaled, and the local aspect is missing. How good is this relative to using it for a specific project in a specific town? So that was one big goal. And then the other piece was being able to provide an idea about the uncertainty or certainty of the values that are given. So a lot of times there's only one or two scenarios, or maybe a handful. But as we've been hearing, it's a lot more important. It's very important to get a range of ideas of the future so that you can know, based on maybe the criticality of your project, whether you want to go with a 90% certain value or a median. So how do we estimate the probability of future events? Well, usually the answer is lots and lots of simulations, but those usually range in the dozens, and as I'll show you, this project really went above and beyond that, and I'll show you how they did that. So those simulations usually are variations on future scenarios that are most plausible. That's very common. But the other piece that this project took on is looking at error. So what's the error in the modeling itself? And this piece I have found often missing and unattended. So this is the general pathway for modeling. You have the emission scenario, you maybe pick a high and low, and then it goes through the GCM, and then the precipitation temperature outputs go into a watershed model, and then you get stream flow out of the watershed model. And you maybe get a couple of dozen estimates. So what Cornell did was they created something called the stochastic weather generator. It's a statistical model that can be run a lot faster than a global circulation model, as you can imagine. So you can do a lot more scenarios. And so what they did was they took thermodynamic change, so temperature increases from GCMs. The dynamic part of climate change will be addressed in the next phase, which is the dynamic part is the big shift in global circulation. This one took just the temperature increase part, applied it to a local weather generator so that the local weather generator has the local weather regimes in it, the local elevations, all the things global models can't account for. So we take the global forcing, if you will, and then apply it to the local weather generator. And what happens is we use 17 warming conditions from 0 to 8 degrees Celsius with increments of 0.5 degrees Celsius. This represents projections from about 20 GCMs that were found most probable. And then each of these 17 conditions is simulated 100 times to represent natural variability in climate. And so you end up with 1,700 climate simulations. And those were taken by the USGS and fed through their watershed model. And the streamflow outputs were then used by Tufts to create the stochastic watershed model. And that model corrected for errors in flow. So in general, in watershed modeling, you calculate to the average flow, and the extremes tend to be not as great. And so this created an error model to have corrections for those flows that we're actually interested in, which is the extremes, not necessarily the average. And so from this error model, they could do 10,000 simulations to get an idea for the range of values that could come out based on the errors that are known in the model. So it really does give you a good idea on that sense. And then the 1,700 climate simulations have taken 10,000 simulations for each to represent the error and possible variability due to error. And you end up with 17 million hydrologic simulations. And so from those, you can definitely calculate some probabilities of what's a most probable flow that you're interested in. So the type of outputs for climate, so climate simulations, you'll have your usual precipitation temperature statistics, but you'll also get the 10th, 50th, and 90th values for all of those, depending on what scenarios you choose that will represent natural climate variability. And then these results will be updating the Climate Resilient Design Standards tool that I'll talk about next. And these are estimated to go up somewhere in the next couple of months and will be on resilientma.org. So I will keep coming back to that website, resilientma.org. And then hydrologic simulations, a pilot study was done, and those we're working right now whether to release just at least that much of it or whether we'll wait till there's the state rollout of that piece. That's sort of a bigger level of effort and still being worked on. But you'll get your usual flow statistics, the whole range of flow statistics, high flows, low flows, and everything in between. But then there'll be the probabilistic output. So for example, if you have a design that's already in place and it was designed for a certain flow, you can now would be able to go in and say, what's my probability of failure in the future instead of what I calculated back when I designed it. So that could tell you how much adaptation is needed of that infrastructure. And then you'll be able to ask the opposite as well. If you're designing something new and you have a certain threshold for a probability of failure, then what flow should you design to? So these guiding numbers will be, I think, very helpful, especially given the probabilities and people understanding a bit about how big that range potentially is. So quickly to the Climate Resilient Design Standards tool. This tool, you put in the project information and the location, and it'll give you your preliminary exposures to climate change, which types of climate impacts you'll be affected by, risk rating, so depending on the criticality and type of project you have, times the likeliness of the exposure, gives you a low, medium, high, and then you might be provided standards that are quantitative precipitation standards or potentially guidance methodology, best practices, things like that. And it's a range of projects, everything from parks to water supply infrastructure, very comprehensive. And this was designed for state-funded projects, but it is available for the public to use. And as you can see, you can access it off of resilientma.org. And it's intended to be an early planning and design tool because each project has its own specifics. And so you must do your own diligence on that front. And then finally, the Drought dashboard. These are the 6 pieces of data that we monitor. And we used to calculate these more or less by hand. I call Excel by hand these days. And it would take us, a day or two. And we would be able to do it once a month given staffing. But now we've automated a lot of the measurement systems, and we have a dashboard that automatically calculates it for us monthly as well as weekly. And the weekly is really important given the flash droughts I mentioned. So this upgrade has really helped us. We're able to call task force meeting if needed sub-monthly rather than just a monthly time frame. And finally, what can you do about droughts? So staff worked really hard to put together the water conservation toolkit. You can see there's lots of different audiences, and I'll just give you one example. There's best practices and guidance, but there's also ready to go outreach materials. So for public water suppliers during the dry season, or especially during droughts, they have little infographics that are ready to go on how to save water and giving people ideas. So that covers my topics, and Resilient MA is the place to go, and thank you.
That was great, and you should get paid for the resilientma.org plugs. You did a great job there, and it's a fantastic resource for those who do not practice or work here in Massachusetts. Encourage you to check it out. Like it is, it's the repository, it's the clearinghouse. It's a great resource. So I think I have a couple minutes just to ask Vicki a couple questions, and then we will be working into a networking break, and you'll be part of a panel, so there'll be more of a chance for interaction. So I have a couple questions, I think, for you. I guess I've kind of met you through the Water Resources Commission, which I don't know if many people are familiar with kind of that group and its charge, but would you just perhaps expand a little bit on that, the Water Resources Commission and your involvement with that and how that kind of ties into overall drought management for the state?
Sure, absolutely. The Water Resources Commission meets once a month, and I'm not going to try to tell you the date that it was initiated. I didn't come that prepared. But they deal with a lot of water policy issues, so things like the Interbasin Transfer Act, they're in charge of that. And when there's 27 major basins in the state, and if people want to transfer water supply or wastewater across the major basins, then you have to go through this approval process to make sure that it's really necessary. So that's one example. They also are in charge of the water conservation standards. So these are just some examples, and really writing policy. And I'm involved through the Office of Water Resources. The Office of Water Resources staff is about 10 people, and we serve this commission. So when they need things analyzed or prepared, we kind of do the work and they do the reading and the questions, and we come back to them, and that's sort of the process. And how that relates to the Drought Task Force. So the Drought Task Force, you asked that too, right? Yeah, that's sort of a separate entity. So Water Resources Commission sits under EEA, which is the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And then the same thing with the Drought Task Force. So EEA chairs the Water Resources Commission, which is usually set in on by Vandana Rao, who's the Water Policy Director. And then the Drought Management Task Force is joint between MEMA and EEA. And Vandana usually, the Water Policy Director, usually sits in for the secretary there. And then MEMA usually sends a person as well. So they're both under EEA, but separate initiatives.
Great. And I think that brings us kind of to our shifted networking break. And Jackson has a few things, just housekeeping again, to let you know what to expect. But please, a round of applause for Vicki. Thank you.
Thanks for re-engaging, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome our next forum co-chair, our moderator, Melanie Garate. She is a climate resiliency manager, or the climate resiliency manager with the Mystic River Watershed Association, which is a Boston area watershed association. She works with municipal staff, community-based organizations, public health officials, and local residents to increase climate resiliency regionally. Thank you, Melanie.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's so great to see you all in real life, and all of you who are joining virtually. It's so wonderful to see so many of the colleagues that I've worked with virtually for so long now, finally in person. So thank you all so much for showing up. We'll now move on to the heat portion of the forum. And we want to understand how extreme heat is impacting communities locally, and then also what we've been learning from across the country, especially in the Southwest. So we'll continue those learnings. But first I want to give a little preamble, and for those of you who have been following my work with the Museum of Science on the Wicked Hot Mystic Project, you probably heard this spiel before, so apologize to you. But here in the Boston area and in the Northeast overall, we know how to budget for salt in the wintertime, right? So we're a winter culture. We haven't really moved on to understanding how our communities are impacted by extreme heat, and how to prepare them for all that is here now and all of that is to come. And so we know how to budget for salt on our roads in the wintertime. We know how to do the penguin shuffle when getting into our cars, right? But what about the summer? How do we keep up with the heat? And so that is what we are going to learn today. And with that, I'll introduce our first speaker, who is joining us virtually. So, oh, there we are. Hi, David. Wonderful. And so David is joining us all the way from Phoenix. He is the Director of Heat Response and Mitigation for the City of Phoenix. He joined the city in October 2021 to spearhead the nation's first publicly funded municipal office focused on extreme heat. And so that office was created as a part of Phoenix's $2.8 million city council approved climate and heat readiness investment. And so I can already tell that we're going to learn so much from David's presentation that we can apply here in the Northeast. And so with that, I'll hand it over to David to begin his presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Melanie, and good morning, everyone from Phoenix. Hope you can hear me okay. Sorry not to be with you there in person. My wife and I are enjoying life as new parents. We have a 5-month-old, and of course, we're still learning how to manage the day-to-day, but I'm so thankful for the opportunity to be able to join virtually. Thanks to the organizing team, EBC, all the event partners, and the production team for what's really been a smooth experience and comfortable experience to make it possible for so many of us to join from all around the world. While I am looking forward to sharing what we are doing here in the city of Phoenix and in the Phoenix metro area, please know that I approach this conversation from a place of humility, of recognizing that we all have shared learning to do. So I'll be taking notes eagerly when we move into the discussion portion as well. As you can see, the title of the presentation is New Approaches to Managing Heat in the Nation's Hottest Large City. We are the hottest in terms of summer average temperature. Miami could compete with us in terms of year-round temperature. Our winters are a little cooler than theirs are. And we'll just wait for the slides to switch on the background here. But boy, I thought Melanie's comments were really spot on in thinking about this culture shift. You mentioned the penguin shuffle, Melanie, and I think our equivalent here in the summer is the delicate touch of the steering wheel when we get in our vehicles, essentially the start of May through the end of September. Without a delicate touch or putting a towel on the steering wheel, it's a surefire way to get one's hands burned. All right, just waiting to see the slides switch on the back end. Thanks so much for the production team's help. I wanted to start by, let's see here. Yeah, that is still the other presentation. Thanks so much, production team. They are chatting with me in the background. We're looking for some purple slides. While we get those set up, I wanted to just start our comments by acknowledging why we are thinking about new approaches to managing heat here in our city. Unfortunately, we see a number of data points that are moving in the wrong direction here in our region. And one of those is the number of heat-associated deaths that are reported in our community. We're really fortunate here in Maricopa County that our health department has had a really robust heat health surveillance system that they instituted back in the mid-2000s after a particularly severe heat event. So it's fantastic that we have this resource in our community to understand who is getting sick and dying from heat. It can help us target our investments to the communities and populations that are most impacted. But unfortunately, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of heat-associated deaths since 2014. I remember when I first moved to Arizona in 2013, we said we're pushing upwards of 100 heat-associated deaths in our county each year, a county of about 4.5 to 5 million people. And in 2021, the county health department reported nearly 340 heat-associated deaths. That's more than a 450% increase over just a 7 to 8 year time span. That far outpaces anything we would expect in terms of population growth, demographic transition. It is not a reporting signal as best we can tell. So we see indicators, that really critical indicator of heat-associated deaths moving in the wrong direction. We also approach this conversation recognizing that heat is a quality of life concern in addition to a public health concern. There's a quote from a resident of South Phoenix that emerged in one of our neighborhood-based heat action planning processes that the Nature Conservancy led locally here recently. And the quote is that there's no place to keep cool. We talk about that kind of stuff. We talk about how it's a cycle. The kids don't really go outside to play because it's too hot. They'd rather stay indoors and watch movies, play on Xbox, watch Netflix. That brings about illnesses, obesity, that kind of stuff. We get the sense that this is not just about those acute illnesses and deaths, but also about broader health issues and quality of life issues. I also wanted to talk about why we think a new approach is needed in terms of what's happening internally with our city operations. Hazard mitigation planning has been mentioned a couple of times in our conversation already today. And if we were to look back at the Phoenix section of the 2015 hazard mitigation plan in our county, there are 4 and only 4 proposed heat actions: sharing data resources among city departments and with external partners, operating cooling centers and hydration stations, attention to revisions to the building code, and focusing on stipulations in rezoning. And that is it. That is what our hazard mitigation plan described for heat in the nation's hottest large city in 2015, which we perceive as a huge missed opportunity. My colleague Braden Kay in the city of Tempe describes the hazard mitigation planning process as our chance to write a love letter to the federal government articulating what it is that we would like to be doing to managing hazards. And I think we could, in this room collectively, come up with a much longer list of actions we'd like to propose. And indeed, we've seen a wonderful transition since 2015, where multiple jurisdictions have really strengthened their heat-related section of the hazard mitigation plan. And one other example of how I think we need to be thinking about new approaches to managing heat in terms of what's happening in local government operations. This is a meeting we facilitated, helped facilitate in 2015, 2016, a number of years ago, when Phoenix had the chance to participate in the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge. And for anyone in the room that's worked with Bloomberg, you might remember that they are really interested in prototyping, in rapidly testing crude starts toward ideas. And we had a question, an assumption we wanted to test, that it would be possible for the city to work across departments to come together to articulate goals and a vision related to how we were managing heat. So we asked the deputy city manager, this is while I was still on the faculty at ASU, we asked the deputy city manager at the time, who coincidentally now is my boss at the city, to put together an all-star team of the leaders across city departments that were involved in the heat conversation. So this was the hypothetical heat task force that's been assembled in this room for what you can see is a post-it note brainstorming session to see if we could articulate some sense of goals and visions for heat. And in the first 10 minutes of the meeting, my teammates and I from ASU, we were just picking up on this weird vibe that the conversation wasn't moving as smoothly as we hoped it would. And we paused and asked the question, I can't remember whose idea it was to ask, but we asked, how many of you have worked together in this room before? And somebody spoke up and said, well, not only have we not worked together, I'm not even sure I know everybody in this room. We had missed the need to introduce ourselves to each other. This was a hand-picked team of the city leaders working on heat. And in some cases, they hadn't known each other before. That was a a big red flag to us that even in a city that has had a lot happening for heat, in terms of how departments were working together, maybe a new approach, a new model was necessary. And this past year, as was mentioned, our city council and mayor recognized the need to try something new, try something different, and created the nation's, what we believe is the nation's first publicly funded office focused on heat as part of the climate and heat readiness investment that was mentioned. This investment also includes some additional funding in our urban forest. It included some funding to enhance some of our data resources related to water strategy, related to urban forestry, added new staff to support urban forestry. It was a large package that was in fact the most favorably commented upon in our public budget process last year. The Office of Heat Response and Mitigation is a lean and mean team. We have four folks as part of this new office. We're situated as part of the city manager's office in the city of Phoenix. In addition to director and administrative support, we have an urban tree program manager, and we have a built environment specialist whose job we interpret to be to focus on all of the non-tree related cooling strategies that the city might use, including attention to the building code, rezoning cases, et cetera, as we mentioned previously. Our office has no programmatic budget, which I think implies that our job is to be an influencer, a connector, a persuader, working with all of the bigger, larger, more well-funded city departments to try to create a culture around attention to heat management and heat safety, and implement and institutionalize processes and thinking that will ensure that we are not missing opportunities to help cool the city and help keep people safe when it is hot. We've been trying to articulate a vision for what our office should be working on and how we will work. And I won't spend time highlighting, going into all of these bullet points, but you can see them on the slide here. Just to pick out a couple. We interpret our charge to both be thinking about short-term actions to help keep people safe when it is hot, what we call heat response, and longer-term strategies that can cool the city and make it more comfortable, protect our infrastructure, and we call that heat mitigation in our operations. We're certainly trying to be data-driven, trying to evaluate our impact as best we can. A couple of other elements of our vision: because we have this distinctive opportunity to have staff whose job it is to think about heat, we're trying to step forward and help coordinate local and regional initiatives. We, for example, help staff the Arizona Heat Resilience Work Group that meets bi-weekly to help organizations talk about what they're doing, what resources we need. We're really happy to contribute to supporting that effort. The last two elements here we very much see as our pillars: being responsive to community needs and guidance, not only listening to the conversation from today, but also the conversation that's accumulated over 10, 20, 30 years. The perspective of some of our community members is that we already have way too many surveys, plans, studies, social media comments, public letters that have been submitted to the city. We need to act on those ideas that have been accumulating for so long. And we are certainly trying to approach our work from a position of advancing heat equity. As many in the room are familiar with, the disparities in heat, tree canopy cover, and other metrics from one neighborhood to the next are quite stark in our region. The health impact statistics track with those differences at the neighborhood scale and from one population group to another. So we're trying to invest resources in underserved communities and populations as best we can, while understanding that we still have more learning to do about what that is, what those differences are, and how we can meaningfully work with community partners to impact them. What are the goals that are pulling us forward? We are in a new office. We are very much learning our way, but we can find some sense of direction from existing planning documents already in place, whether they're from the city, from the county, or from the region. Here are some of the goals that we are trying to contribute to. Those include an interesting urban forestry goal in our climate action plan to create 100 cool corridors by 2030. These are targeted investments in providing tree and shade canopy on our busy pedestrian streets. Increasing how we're using reflective materials and infrastructure projects. That also appears in our climate action plan. I wanted to highlight these two providing resources and services to residents to manage heat, and reducing the incidence of heat illness and death in our community. The first one of those appears in our climate action plan as a goal. The latter appears in a statewide climate and health adaptation plan. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our work over the past 7 months to try to put together a plan to work toward those goals. We were so fortunate to be charged with and have the opportunity to lead the development of the city's first heat response plan over the past 7 months, which is in place for this summer. We look enviously at what Boston has put together recently in terms of their big package of a heat response, of a heat plan that's both heat response and mitigation. Our exercise is really to put down on paper, what are we going to be doing this summer? This was the first time we had ever had all of those actions in one document. So we could at least look at the entire portfolio and think about where we are investing and where we're not investing, but also really use that as a springboard to thinking about a longer term, more comprehensive planning process for heat safety. All of these departments and programs at the city contributed to our heat response plan process in one way or another. And you probably see some likely suspects on the list and also some unlikely suspects on the list. It was actually a harder exercise for us to rule out any departments than to rule them in. We think because heat touches so many parts of daily life, so many sectors of the city, we think that there's a spot for every city department in participating in this conversation. And in fact, we're probably arguing short if we don't have every single department at the table. Our heat response plan wound up presenting 30, and it's since grown to 31 different initiatives that we organized into 6 different buckets. And those buckets included improving situational awareness at City Hall of what's happening with heat, a wide variety of public engagement and outreach efforts. There's a category of items related to cool space and drinking water, one related to home environments, one related to mobility and recreation, and the final category of actions in a category called workplaces and schools. And I wanted to highlight just a few of the specific initiatives from each of these buckets to not necessarily give you a sense of what they are, but how our office as a new office has contributed to or might be contributing to the thinking about our heat response programs. Certainly improving situational awareness at City Hall is something that we've really taken the reins of trying to build a culture of awareness across departments and external partners. What are we doing on a day-to-day basis for heat? How are those programs and services operating? And what are we seeing in terms of community impact and community demand for services? So we've arranged a wide range of partners, including our fire department, including Arizona 211. We're having an exploratory pilot stage conversation with Google that has all been synthesized together at this point into a weekly email that's distributed to all city leadership, all city council offices, and a number of external partners. You get a sense of everything from how many water bottles have our initiatives handed out, how many people have we seen at cooling centers, how many folks are calling 211 to ask about when the city swimming pools will open, what are we seeing in terms of heat illness and death statistics. And our hope is that by putting together this weekly report, our offices and people who are reading the report will identify opportunities to pivot, adjust, change course, maybe increase our investments in certain initiatives as the summer is moving along in near real time. We do have a direct heat relief outreach program that is certainly true in the locations of many other locations represented in the audience today. What we've been really happy to see over the first month of the warm season here, we were able to connect the dots between this program as it existed in the past with our volunteer program office and our community emergency response team members, and bring into that conversation staff from the city's homeless services division, which has, I think, really amplified the potential impact of this problem. Not only are we able to get water in folks' hands and hats and sunscreen, remind folks where the nearest cooling center and hydration station is, but now we have a professional case manager and we can start answering bigger questions about getting connected to housing, getting connected to food stamps. I think it's made the conversation much more robust. And for us here in Phoenix and for so many other cities, the heat problem and what's happening with homelessness, those issues are so intertwined. So any touch point we have where we can at least move a conversation forward about helping somebody get off the streets or access other services, we think is a really important investment from a heat safety perspective. We highlighted in the heat response plan that the city has a cooling ordinance that has the details you can see on the slide here. Unintended consequence of this is one of our city councilors asked as we were presenting the heat response plan why those numbers are the way they are and can they be lower? So that has created some homework for us to pursue over the next several months, both understanding the history and thinking about what might be possible for even stronger enforcement or thresholds moving forward. And as I mentioned before, the heat challenge and our challenge with homelessness and affordable housing, those issues are so intertwined. So a really big component of our heat response plan talked about what we're doing to improve access to shade and cool space at the various service providers for our unsheltered neighbors. And the only financial ask in our heat response plan was for an investment that was made with other organizations in our area to invest in a new shelter online. And I think this has been such an interesting part of the experience thus far, 7 months in learning how we can and need to be getting behind some of the other departments that are making investments that, you know, I wouldn't say adding a shelter to help our unsheltered neighbors. It doesn't sound like a heat relief investment at the top level, but it absolutely is when we're providing 100 or 200 more beds for spaces for day and night relief. Those are 100 to 200 more folks from the absolute highest risk category in our area. They'll have access to cool space, and I think that's been such an important partnership. Just to wrap up here on a couple of the elements of our heat response plan, we put forward 3 goals for this year's plan. And again, this is just a start as we think about a more comprehensive plan moving forward. Our first goal is to see a reduction in heat associated deaths in our city. And we can measure that using the data I mentioned before from our local county health department. We'd also like to see fewer calls for service to the city related to heat. Of course, we want to meet all of the calls that come in. We're not trying to discourage folks from calling us, but we think that is one indication of demand of the public health impact of heat is the number of people that are calling for service related to heat. And then it's also our goal to evaluate 100% of the now 31 heat response programs and services that were described in the plan to really understand how well they're working and what investments we need to make next year. To wrap up very briefly, a few additional highlights. We've been really invested in the conversation around American Rescue Plan Act funding and the Federal Infrastructure Act to try to align heat mitigation and heat response opportunities with some of the other projects that are moving forward. Our office is certainly taking a lead in managing conversations with partners, whether they be small community organizations or the state health department, really a wide range, a wide spectrum. We've been charged with picking up the Tree and Shade Master Plan that the city last wrote in 2010 and revising it. And then our office has filled this interesting role, I think, over our first several months in operating almost in a scientific advisory capacity to other city departments. And in some cases, that has put us in front of the media to talk about the heat-related programs and services that other departments are implementing. I know that was a quick high-level tour of how we've started the conversation. I know we'll have some great conversation on the panel moving forward. But again, just wanted to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and really looking forward to your wonderful ideas on how we can do better here in the city of Phoenix. Thanks so much.
Much, David. Thanks so much, David. I think you really highlighted how extreme heat is something that impacts different populations, especially vulnerable populations in our communities, and that it is an health crisis in this area, as well as a climate crisis. And I think you also highlighted something really important, that it takes a really big team, a really huge effort to tackle this in our community. So thank you so much. It always surprises me, or I always think about how for so long we phrased or we framed climate change as global warming, yet we didn't really prepare our communities for this extreme heat. So thank you so much for all your learnings. We're gonna hold questions until after the next presenter, and then move on to the panel discussion. And so I will start off by giving a warm welcome to Zoe Davis of the City of Boston. I'm very honored to be able to introduce her. She is a Mystic River Watershed alum. Now she works for the City of Boston as the Climate Resilience Project Manager, and on the Climate Ready Boston team, she has served as project manager for Boston's heat plan. And so in the Northeast, or in the Massachusetts area, we have started to plan for heat. So municipalities like the City of Chelsea, the City of Somerville, and many others have started to tackle this issue. And the City of Boston just came out about a month ago on Earth Day with their Boston plan. So I'm very excited to have Zoe with us today, so she can share their lessons learned and their plan for tackling extreme heat. With that, here you go, Zoe.
Thanks so much, Melanie, for that warm welcome. All right. Yeah, so today I'm going to give an overview of Boston's heat plan and talk a little bit about some of the projects that we have going on this summer coming from the heat plan. So the story of the heat plan actually begins with Climate Ready Boston. So for those, I'm sure many of you are aware what Climate Ready Boston is. But in 2016, Boston published the Climate Ready Boston report. And so this is a comprehensive report on the ongoing strategies and policies that we need to deliver in order to ensure that Boston can thrive in the face of a changing climate. So Climate Ready Boston responds to 4 major climate hazards, including extreme temperatures, extreme precipitation, sea level rise, and coastal storms. And it identified strategies to address 3 major climate risks. So that includes extreme heat, stormwater flooding, and coastal and riverine flooding. And these are all climate risks that Boston is currently facing today. And so that's why building a more resilient Boston is about addressing the near-term and the long-term impacts of climate change, but also addressing climate impacts in a holistic way by taking a layered approach. So this means building in effective redundancies and diverse solutions. And this includes thinking about the way that we retrofit and build new buildings, integrate resilience into our major public infrastructure projects, for our roads as well, and the way that we integrate climate resilience into education and our laws and zoning in order to really achieve a citywide strategy to ensure that Boston can thrive. So as a coastal city, Boston faces multiple climate hazards. And heat risk is significant for Boston because it's immediate. Even a few weeks ago, before the summer even started, we had our first emergency, heat emergency. But it's also significant because extreme heat is the #1 cause in weather-related deaths in the US, more than hurricanes or tornadoes. And it's significant because heat risk is projected to increase over the century. So in Massachusetts, temperatures have increased by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the 20th century. It doesn't seem like a massive increase, but even small increases in temperature can have massive impacts. And so in terms of the number of heat days that we're looking forward to, by the 2070s, it's likely that Boston will experience around 130 days over 80 degrees and around 60 days over 90 degrees each year. So when we talk about what will be the norm for Boston, we can see a shift overall in the fact that our summers will be longer and our summers will be hotter. And so that's why we're planning for heat risk today. So the heat plan, the official name, Heat Resilient Solutions for Boston, presents a city-wide framework to prepare Boston for hotter summers, with a particular focus on environmental justice communities in the city. And so when I'm talking about environmental justice communities specifically, we're looking at communities of color, lower income communities, and households where there's limited English proficiency. So this plan was funded by the state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant, the MVP Action Grant, through the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And during the development of the plan, we worked with 2 committees. So this included the Community Advisory Board. This was a diverse group of folks from across the city, diverse representation and levels of expertise, or areas of expertise, varying levels of previous engagement with city processes. And really, we brought the CAB together to help us inform community engagement, but to also ensure that community priorities were being integrated into the strategies, bringing community voices closer into the process. And the next committee we worked with is the steering committee. So this was a group composed primarily of city departments, agencies, and commissions. And similarly, they helped to drive the community engagement process. They helped us to define the goals and the strategies themselves, the goals of the heat plan, the strategies themselves, and also help to inform some of the implementation considerations as well. And then also on the project team, we worked with a great consultant team, Sasaki, Climate, and WSP, and all ACEs to help facilitate this process. So the heat plan was essentially, we wanted to recognize that there are a number of overlapping topics when it comes to heat, trees, and open space. And so the heat plan was developed in coordination with 2 other ongoing city plans. These are still ongoing, the Urban Forest Plan and the Open Space and Recreation Plan, and these plans are being spearheaded by the Boston Parks and Recreation Department. And so again, because we recognize that there are a number of overlapping factors, public health, urban planning, workforce development related to heat, trees, and open space, we wanted to really ensure that these plans were speaking to one another, and that we were coordinating outreach and coordinating data as well. So as we plan for extreme heat, we really want to consider a range of factors that impact experiences with extreme heat. And this is really all to recognize that equitable resilience broadly means putting people at the center. And so in addition to looking at the weather related factors, the built environment related factors, we can really deliver a more just and equitable outcome for residents by also increasing access to cooling resources and addressing the underlying factors that result in greater burdens upon some residents. And so some of these factors include historic development practices that were reinforced by systemic racism and inequity. And so by considering neighborhood histories and social systems that have influenced infrastructure development and policy, we can better understand why some neighborhoods are hotter than others, and how history has impacted the built environment, access to services, and personal experiences. So these are maps that were produced through the heat plan process. What it is showing is that all of Boston experiences extreme heat conditions. So the blue here is not cold, it's just less hot. But what it's showing really is that some areas of Boston are hotter than others. Some enter high heat conditions sooner, reach higher temperatures, and remain hotter for longer. And so to analyze how extreme heat is distributed across the city, the team developed these urban canopy maps from an urban canopy model, looking particularly at air temperature. And so to develop these maps, we chose a week sample period in the summer of 2019, in July, which was one of the hottest weeks in July, to essentially model what air temperature was like during an extreme heat event. So the model combines land use and land cover characteristics, building footprints, water and vegetation indices, as well as meteorological data. And from the model, we've developed 4 air temperature maps. 2 are here. I'll show the other 2 on the next slide. But they include the daytime and the nighttime temperature, urban heat island index, and heat event duration. And so for the daytime temperatures, high daytime temperatures generally follow a more solar exposed areas with hardscape, limited vegetation, or limited wind ventilation as well. And so this map, is particularly useful. The daytime map is particularly useful for identifying where to prioritize strategies for shading, to shade those solar exposed areas. For the nighttime temperatures map, the trends that we're seeing, they generally follow areas that retain and slowly release stored heat. And so urban centers with a lot of urban massing trap heat within the urban canopy. And another factor is due to limited vegetation as well, and limited sky views. And this leads to high thermal storage. And so the nighttime map is particularly useful when identifying where to prioritize strategies for indoor cooling, especially, and where ensuring that ventilation in urban design is a priority. And also considering where reflective or light-colored materials for roofs and roads might be considered. So this is the second set of maps. This is showing urban heat island index and heat event duration. And so the urban heat island index map, this essentially shows the amount of heat relative to the coolest point in the city. And so for Boston, one of these areas, the deepest blue, you'll find in Franklin Park. And so this index highlights both the intensity of heat as well as the duration of heat to show where areas are the hottest, but are also hot for prolonged periods of time. Now the heat event duration map is slightly different because it's actually showing time rather than heat itself, which I think is interesting. The heat duration map considers all of the hours where temperatures were above 95 degrees and also above 95 degrees in the daytime, but also above 75 degrees in the nighttime. So this map is particularly useful for identifying strategies around where to prioritize access to cooling resources, especially in the evening hours, thinking about if for public resources such as parks, cooling centers, if like extending hours is necessary. And so following the development of these maps, the team conducted an analysis using the 1938 Homeowners Loan Corporation map alongside the extreme heat and land cover metrics to understand the impacts of historic development practices on the spatial distribution of heat in the city. So just for reference, the HOLC map used a series of grades to rate riskiness of mortgage lending in many cities across the US, particularly through the 30s and the 40s. And the grading system was largely based on race. And so what you see here is a comparison of the 4 grades: best, still desirable, declining, and hazardous, relative to the heat duration map. And just by a visual comparison, you can see that there's quite a stark difference between the areas that are graded best and still desirable, typically cooler, versus the areas that were graded hazardous, which tend to trend in the hotter direction. And so to analyze these maps, the team used heat metrics, heat duration, urban heat island, surface temperature, the daytime and the nighttime temperature, as well as green space metrics, looking at percent parkland, tree canopy, and percent impervious surface. And so what this graphic shows is a comparison of the 4 grades for each metric across the city. And the values that you're seeing here are relative to the city medians for each metric. And so the areas that were graded best or still desirable are typically cooler for all of the heat metrics, whereas redlined areas are hotter across these metrics at up to about 7.5 degrees hotter in the day and 3.6 degrees hotter at night. And then for these green space metrics, areas graded best or still desirable typically have today a 20% more composition of parkland and about a 40% more composition of tree canopy. So we know that while all of Boston is hot, extreme temperatures are not distributed equally, as we can see in this map, with impacts of extreme heat particularly disproportionately impacting environmental justice communities. And so to ensure that the strategies and the goals and the outcomes from this process were attentive to the needs of environmental justice communities, we decided to focus the development of the strategies themselves with folks who live and work and serve these communities. So we identified 5 neighborhood focus areas for this study: Chinatown, East Boston, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury. And the identification of these areas was completed through the 2016 vulnerability assessment at first, so looking at social vulnerability and the heat data that we had at the time. So I wanted to share this slide just to show that during the community engagement process, we sought to understand really the everyday human experience, going back to, again, putting people at the center. And so this is Heat Stories Comic Builder. It's a tool that we used as part of our community engagement strategy to really share stories and build empathy across the folks that were participating in this process with us. And ultimately the goal was to also increase awareness about the diversity of experiences that people have when it comes to heat. So I'm not going to read all 3 of these, but essentially, as we were developing our strategies, these were sort of the 3 critical elements that are integrated into each of these strategies. Thinking around exposure, how do we reduce that? How do we prioritize areas that are more sensitive to heat? And how do we help increase access to cooling resources? So these are the strategies themselves. There are 26 strategies to increase access to cooling resources and reduce localized extreme temperatures. And afterwards, I'm happy to dig into these strategies. But each of these 8 layers sort of holds these 26 strategies. And finally, as I wrap up here, I did just want to share some of the projects that are ongoing to advance heat resilience directly from the heat plan. And so Boston is developing our own extreme temperatures response task force to really have a unified body around citywide mobilization of resources to respond to heat. We're also in the process of moving through a cool roof program to actually implement cool roofing with a focus on community-based organizations and environmental justice communities. And finally, I have to wrap up. We do have a cooling kits program working with community-based organizations to provide cooling at their events and really expand options for cooling in the city. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Zoe. I appreciate everybody's conversations today. We're now going to move on to the panel. So if Vicky could also come up and have a seat over there, and then we'll have David from Arizona up on the screen in just a second. Oh, there you are. Hello. And so just a bit of some housekeeping. If everybody could take a look at their blue surveys on your tables, please take just a minute to fill them out so that way we can know what worked, what didn't, what could be better, and what you also want to hear about in the future for future climate adaptation forums. And then in terms of the way that we're going to moderate this panel discussion, since we are a hybrid event, we are going to be really careful in terms of asking questions and the way that we ask questions. And so in terms of the speakers, just wait for me to call your name, that we can be really clear as to who is going. So if David will answer a question, I will call on David. If Vicky is going to answer a question, I'll call. And if you want to answer the question, just please raise your hand. And then in terms of the audience here in person, if you could raise your hand, and then when Jackson goes over to you with the mic, please speak very clearly, ask questions concisely as much as possible, and then also state your name and affiliation so the virtual attendees can know who is speaking. And for those who are joining us virtually, please make sure to just add your questions to the chat. Lauren has been moderating those, and so she'll bring those questions up to us. Did I miss anything? Good? Okay, amazing, great. And so with that, I will start the Q&A. Okay, got the go ahead. And so I'll ask the first question. So this one is for David. I'm really curious to know if there has been any conversation about future, so not now, but maybe 50, 100 or more years from now in terms of managed retreat. And so that's something that we've talked about really briefly, or starting to talk about in coastal municipalities and coastal regions. But I'm very curious to learn if that's something that has been talked about in really hot, arid areas.
Yeah, it's a great question, Melanie. Thanks so much. And again, thanks for putting together such a fantastic program. And Zoe, really enjoyed hearing more of the details of the plan there. Such beautiful work. There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind, Melanie, in response to your question. One is that I think we could argue that there's already some form of retreat, in quotes with a lowercase r, that happens here already. We see very, very strong seasonal in-migration and out-migration from our region. Not only tourists coming to spend their winters here, but also residents of our region seeking cooler locations during the summers. But that is an option available for those who can afford to do so, whether it's work flexibility or the cost of travel. And we've certainly heard some conversation about who might be left behind if this region continues to develop in a way that is not meeting the challenge of heat. But we have plenty of reason to be optimistic that we can meet the challenge of heat, not only with improving our heat response and heat safety elements, but some of the regional climate model projections suggest that with widespread deployment of cooling strategies like reflective roofs, like trees, we could wind up with a Phoenix of the future that is cooler than the one we have today, even as global warming continues. We can urbanize in essentially a heat neutral way, or even in a way that allows us to chip away at some of the additional warming that's brought by global scale climate change. And we are, of course, very optimistic and hopeful that we can realize that future.
Thank you so much. Now I'll open up questions to the audience here in person. So if someone wants to raise their hand, oh, I see one right over there, Jackson. So again, if you can just speak into the mic and say your name and affiliation and your question.
My name is Julie Eaton Ernst. I'm with Weston and Sampson, and I'm also the chair of the EBC Climate Change and Air Committee. Thank you all for your panelists for your presentations. It was really exciting. This question is kind of for all of them. But one of the similarities that struck me between drought and heat was thinking, they're really part of this larger environmental and built system. We've seen that it's not just one development, but it needs to happen everywhere. And so wondering, are there lessons that we already know from stormwater management and treatment and requirements for development that could extend to provide a similar framework for heat to not only incentivize, but show that the developments that we're proposing are not going to worsen heat, but actually reduce and mitigate heat impacts? And do you guys see that as opportunities and sort of that connectivity, especially with reducing impervious surfaces?
Would anyone like to take that question first? I'll give it off to Vicky. Go ahead.
I think, Julie, you're right that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from stormwater and LID, low impact development, and certainly for droughts, low impact development and focusing on recharge. They not only help with the flooding, they help with the drought because now you're recharging. And then a lot of these low impact developments would have more greenery rather than the blacktop, which is better for the heat aspect. So it's like that famous John Muir quote, you tug on one thing in nature and everything else moves with it. So while that can be in a bad way, it can also be in a good way. And I totally agree with you that more education on secondary benefits rather than just the immediate cost to the developer. The challenge is, how do you align incentives? How do you provide incentives for a developer that's gonna just sell something off and they're not invested in the long term? I think that's a tougher regulatory policy question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. David, do you have something to add from the Southwest?
Yeah, I can also I can add that we are trying to do some thinking in this space, and I see opportunities for capacity building in the various firms, whether they be the architectural firms, the landscape architecture firms, the consulting firms that are helping bring development, redevelopment processes forward to the city to understand what we might be looking for and help articulate how development is responding to what we might be looking for from a heat mitigation perspective. We've also recognized that we have a few stumbling blocks in our own city processes right now at some of the stages of the the rezoning process, for example, when we have the opportunity to have the biggest impact as a city in shaping a project, right now the expectations of developers might not have a sufficient level of detail to help us really understand how this project would perform from a heat in quotes perspective. So we're trying to look at the sequencing of when certain details and drawings come forward to really be able to evaluate these questions at the right stage of the process. And it's not going to be an overnight switch, but we're really hopeful that we can get there.
Thank you so much. Lauren, do we have some great questions from the chat?
Yes, we have quite a few. I'm going to combine several that have come in from Stephen, who is from Community Involved in Sustaining Agriculture. His first question was for Vicki and asking about how farmers can use the data you provide. But then I think it was during David's presentation, but it applies to Zoe as well. Are there any heat response programs for farmers or outdoor laborers that you all have been involved in? So I will leave it to Melanie to moderate who goes first.
Sure. How about Zoe, you start, and then David, you can add, and whoever, and then Vicki. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question, thinking about heat response for outdoor workers. That's definitely something that we address in the plan, as outdoor workers are among the groups of folks who are most vulnerable because of their exposure. We do know that at the federal level, there is some work being done around provisions for outdoor workers. And so our goal right now is to be partners in that work as that develops. In terms of some of the near term sort of on the ground work that we have, and this is fairly smaller in scope, but it does have some larger implications for how we connect with outdoor workers, and some of the resources that we may provide for outdoor workers themselves or employers is thinking about the things that we can actually physically give people on site for cooling, and how that opens up opportunities for just education. That alone is that has to be essentially paired with other things, and I think more sort of broader systemic things. You don't want to just hand someone like a water bottle or just a cooling towel and just remind them to stay safe. So I think pairing some of the more on the ground work, handing folks cooling towels, talking to them about heat resilience and heat safety is going to be paired with the work as well that's developing at the federal level.
Thanks, Zoe. And I can imagine that this also has a lot to do with people's English fluency, and then also lots of outdoor workers are in and out seasonally, and so it's something that has to be done over and over again to make sure to reach all of those populations out there. David, do you have something to add?
Really overlapping thoughts with Zoe's. Very interested in the federal rulemaking process, and particularly details around how measurements will be made, who will be making those measurements, what are they representative of, what the thresholds are. So we're eager to participate in that process from a city perspective. And in fact, our human resources department and our human resources safety team is really leading the charge there. In Arizona, and perhaps the other states represented here, some of these questions really fall to state agencies rather than the municipal government. We want to be involved in the conversation. We want to be listening. We want to be trying to set a good example in terms of what we are doing with our municipal workers who have any outdoor exposure. And we're meeting with departments and various levels of the organization to learn those issues. So while I don't have a direct answer with respect to farming and those particular outdoor workers, like Zoe said, we are trying to line our energy up behind the federal conversation and work with our state partners that can help address this, as Zoe said, a very high risk and important population.
Thank you. Vicki?
So I'll just start by saying I'm not in the agricultural department, but I can speak to a couple of things of what might be useful to the sector. One is the drought dashboard can give you a broader view of what's going on right around you. I know a lot of folks have their own moisture sensors and their own precipitation stations, but it could still be helpful. And so these are updated weekly. And you can also just learn what stream gauges and what groundwater wells are around you, and maybe even monitor those specifically in real time, because most of our wells are real time now. Stream flow is always real time. And the wells that aren't real time will be very soon. So there's some upgrades coming in this next coming fiscal year. The other piece is for resilientma.org. So the climate data that will soon go up there, I think will be helpful, both the temperature and the precipitation data, in terms of getting an idea of how precipitation is getting redistributed and what crops might no longer be rain-fed and need to be watered, or what different crops may be better to plant in the future. So these, between the temperature and the longer growing season, and so just getting information on that, like how quickly is that trend coming, and that's the type of information that I could see being useful.
Great. Thank you so much. Lauren, one more?
Just going through, okay. This one is from Carrie Sasparadas, and mostly for David and Zoe, I think, asking about various community planning efforts when talking about heat and how you are including or considering those with different disabilities, both physical, cognitive, sensory challenges, when you're talking about cooling shelters and other items, including access to materials that they can read and understand in their own languages. I'm hoping I've summarized that, Carrie, well. It was a very in-depth, wonderful question online.
I'll pass it to David first and then Zoe.
Yeah, what a great question, and a terrific idea. We've been thinking hard. Every department at the City of Phoenix is expected to have a number of projects engaged with our ADA compliance office, for example. And I think we're going to have a conversation about cooling centers and hydration stations starting on Monday in response to this good idea. There has been a really nice community-based organization-driven heat action planning process here over the past several years. Nature Conservancy facilitated that, as I mentioned earlier. There were a few elements that came out of that plan. I remember particularly related to crosswalks and time, waiting and time that it takes to cross a street as one issue in particular that was raised by one neighborhood. But in general, I think my reaction is that it feels like, at least here in Phoenix, we have just barely scratched the surface on these important conversations, and we need to have a series of meetings with the various service providers that are assisting this particularly vulnerable population to understand how our office can support and get behind their efforts.
Thank you, David. Zoe?
Yeah, this is a particularly ripe conversation that we've been having with the Disabilities Commission in Boston. They've brought this topic to us in how important it is to ensure that when we talk about access, that we're really looking at all of the various types of access we need to be focusing on. And so when we talk about cooling centers, yes, ensuring that there's physical access, but I think even just with accessing information, if we're telling people to go to a cooling center, we need to ensure that they can actually know that we're saying that this is a resource that they can access, in addition to be able to physically getting in there. And so, yeah, it's been good to connect with the Disabilities Commission on that. We've developed a set of resources around utilities assistance, around what you can do in your own home, and around accessing local resources. What we've been talking about is the way that we've presented this material, is this actually accessible? What are the things that may be missing? What are those things that we can add? The Boston Public Health Commission, just considering things like blackouts as, energy resilience is also a conversation within this topic of heat. They have plans to ensure that folks who are dependent on electricity can maintain access in the case of a blackout or a brownout. And so, yeah, this is a ripe conversation. It's an ongoing one.
Thanks so much, all. And I do want to make a quick plug for all of the community-based organizations in the Boston area who are already doing a lot of this work, working with the disabled population, and then also other communities who are more vulnerable to extreme. So a huge shout out to them. I'll move on to a question here in the audience. Someone raise their hand. Oh, wait. Let's go to this side of the room first, and then we'll go over to you. So, Nasser.
Thanks for all the great presentations. I had a question for Zoe. Zoe, I think the Cool Roofs program that you mentioned, it seems like a really interesting and innovative program that maybe other communities in the state could adopt. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of how you designed it. I know it's challenging for public agencies to kind of provide improvements for private properties, like people's rooftops. So just how did you design that program to navigate around any kind of thorny legal issues?
And for those of you who are attending virtually who don't know Nasser's voice, that was Nasser Brahim from Woods Hole Group. Follow the rules.
Nasser, thank you for that question. It's good to see you. The legal, unfortunately, I am not the best person to talk about that. That is actually a project that is actually been taken on by another project manager on my team. So I'd love to follow up with you and others who would be interested to know how that was navigated, because the majority of the process, we had designed this program around really having a cohort and sort of a learning model around what it takes, understanding that it's going to get cold, and so what are some of the impacts that we might see if we put a cool roof on our buildings that are built for northeastern weather. So I apologize, I don't have a robust answer for you on the legal matters, but I'd love to connect you with folks on my team who do have those answers.
Part 2 of the forum coming soon. No. David, do you have any lessons learned to add? If not, we can move on.
We're in the very early stages of our cool roof conversation. I do know that we will have the opportunity to be a little bit more flexible in how we respond as we put some American Rescue Plan Act funding to work in this direction, which avoids some of the pitfalls or limitations that I think the speaker was referring to. But yeah, like Zoe, the technical details here are not in the front of my mind this morning.
Sounds good. Okay, we'll pass it over to this side for a question, and just state your name and affiliation.
Emily, MAPC. I'm curious about for the mitigating solutions to heat in terms of the greening solutions, how you prioritize what to green given like the water scarcity issue, and kind of if you do prioritize, and how do you manage that?
I'm going to guess that's a question for me first.
Go ahead. Go ahead, David.
Yeah. So yeah, a couple of questions there. One, like Boston, we're really blessed to have a number of academic partners and national nonprofits who are helping us develop prioritization tools. Whether it's a high-level tool like the American Forest Tree Equity Map, or more of a precision tool like an internal tool that our ASU partners have helped us build to prioritize individual 1 mile segments of the streetscape. We're trying to build data tools that quantitatively capture what the community priorities have been for increasing tree canopy in the city, where and how. With respect to the water conversation, I'm being mindful that we had an Arizona water expert on earlier who may have more to add, but it's our sense that with attention to tree species selection, with attention to appropriate use of water in the landscape, that like Brenda said earlier, growth and water consumption don't have to be coupled together in the urban forestry conversation. We know that even in our xeriscape landscapes here in Phoenix, so many people are using way more water than is needed. So as we advance some conservation conversations, I think there's a lot of water savings to be had that can be used to support improvements to our urban canopy.
I think we have time for just one more question, and we'll go over to Lauren to take one from the chat.
Okay, I'm trying to combine a conversation that Julie Wormser and Julia Drapkin are having.
Hey, Julie and Julia.
The Julias. They're talking about trees and tree canopy. And David, we heard you talking about tree canopy too. And Ann and I over here were wondering about leafy trees in Arizona, but we're Bostonians, so what do we know? Thinking about planting the right trees for a tree canopy, thinking about the extreme weather we have beyond heat, with wind and with flooding. Are there any best practices, any thoughts you all have had on that? And both for David and Zoe, but Vicky, is there any data that you all have put together that can help us figure out how we do a tree canopy with our crazy weather?
I would steer you to resilientma.org.
Have you all heard of that tool?
And looking in maybe under the agriculture sector, or looking under, mainly under that at MADR, so Massachusetts Department of Agriculture. Because I'm sure there is better suited species than others. Ones that, are hardwood and drop their leaves so they don't have the snow on them in the winter and get bent with a nor'easter, or the myriad of other things that I don't even know, like how shallow the root is of some trees, and that I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But I'm sure that someone has thought about this and put out guidance. So I would try resilientma.org, and if not, then going to the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture and asking them for it, and you might just get something from them, even if they don't have it in the near future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of the panelists, all of the speakers. Yes? Oh, I'm so sorry. Please go ahead and follow up. We'll start with Zoe first, and then David.
Well, what I guess what I have to say about that is stay tuned for the urban forest plan, because that is going to be the most robust resource to know exactly what Boston's doing for our urban tree canopy. So that's something that the Boston Parks and Recreation Department are working on, have been working on for a few years, and I'm really excited to see the work from the heat plan, as well as just all of the other related projects being pulled into that. So stay tuned.
David?
This is in part a maintenance and education question in ensuring that our landscaping companies, contractors, individual residents, know how to plant a tree, maintain it correctly, when to remove the stake. But at a larger strategic level, our regional urban forestry roundtable is just now undertaking a conversation to resolve and integrate our lists, our tree selection and guidance lists, putting together a list of lists, if you will, and resolving discrepancies between them. We do have some really nice lists that help us understand across 10, 15, 20 different dimensions what might be the right tree for the right location. But we have some discrepancies, some disagreements, some redundancy between our recommended lists, our regulatory lists. And I think the answer to this question rests in how all of these lists will be resolved to ensure that we're being mindful about species selection, what feedback we're providing back to the nursery industry, and the actual day-to-day implementation of getting those trees in the ground and taking care of them.
Now, thank you so much to all of the great speakers and panelists. I am going to, before we close out, hand it over to Rebecca Hurst and Gabriela Bocio Santos from the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. So take it away for our closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's so great to see so many of you in person, and hello to all of you who are Zooming in virtually. I'm Rebecca Hurst. I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, and it has been such a pleasure for the last 5 years to be doing this event, and it's really fun to be back here. We have just hired Gabriela Bocio Santos as our new associate director for Sizzle. And many of you already know Gabriela. She has been on the Climate Adaptation Forum steering committee for a number of years. And so I'm going to be stepping back a little bit from the Climate Adaptation Forum and handing things over to Gabriela. I'll still be around, obviously, but really excited for her to be taking more leadership with this program. And with that, I'll let her take it away and close us out. Great to see everybody.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm really, really excited to, move from my steering committee role with the Climate Adaptation Forum to more of an organizer role. I'm really excited to be working with the team here. I'm so grateful to be part of the Sustainable Solutions Lab team, and just looking forward to more great forums. Thank you to everybody who made today such a success. All of the people involved. This ran really wonderfully, and it was a wonderful content too. Thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to everyone who joined us both virtually and in person today. This was fabulous. And please stay tuned for the next one, which will be September 30th. It'll be the first one of our next year of events. And stay tuned to us for what topic that'll be, and hope to see you soon. Also, apologies, going to say one more thing. There are some surveys that are being shared physically on your table if you're in the room, and then virtually if you're joining us virtually. We really, really, really appreciate if you fill those in. We pay attention to them, and we shape the forums based on the feedback that you give us. So please, please fill those in, and thank you very much.